I want to begin by, in a way, picking up on what Kathleen said, is that growth is seen as a gospel. In fact, growth is good, growth is God. And quite a lot of my work is around unpicking growth. And I'll explain what I mean by growth, which is essentially orthodox, undifferentiated GDP measurements of economic activity as a proxy for how well we're doing as a society and economy. And it is a very heterodox position I begin from. It isn't just the fact that, as Kathleen said, there's not much scholarship in this area, but actually I think it's actively discouraged in terms of either career progression, as an interest in terms of funding bodies and so on, because often, certainly in my own career, it's in spite of, not because of, the institutions and research funders that I've worked with, I've been able to progress in my own modest way this rather heterodox position, because often you're as welcome as a fart in a spacesuit from questioning economic growth. Because that's an automatic good. It's like, a force of nature, which I'll go on to towards the end, this naturalization of economic growth. And Jackson, this is Tim Jackson, who wrote a very important, influential book. It's kind of up there for me in recent years with Wilkinson and Pickett on the spirit level. This is Prosperity Without Growth, which he wrote in 2009. And I think he's actually quite correct in terms of saying how absolutely heterodox questioning economic growth in general, but particularly in times of austerity. I mean, I think out there in wider society and in what passes as public debate, certainly in political elite and policy circles, the response to the economic crisis now is the recovery is rather like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz clicking her ruby red slippers. Let's get back to 2008. You want to get back to where we were in terms of economic growth. Maybe with not such an inflated housing system, maybe with some more regulation of the banks, but more or less to go back to a model that we had before the crash. I won't have time to go into it really, unless we pick up in the question and answer at the end, but there is something around this idea that questioning growth is seen as betrayal and disloyalty. And I had a very real experience of this. It was 2 years ago. I was in Canberra on sabbatical at the Australian National University, and I gave a talk in the Australian Senate. It was about the elections at the time that was happening in Ireland here, but I did mention quite a lot about how I saw that the paucity of political debate around issues of growth and so on. And the Irish ambassador lambasted me in private, of course, good civil servant, you don't do it in public, but lambasted me. He said I wasn't on team. I wasn't playing for Team Ireland. He said, you must be a fan of Fintan O'Toole or something. This idea that because I wasn't promoting Ireland as a great place to come and do business, FDI and so on, that I was disloyal as a citizen. And it is partly around this connection we've almost made between economic growth, and certainly in Ireland, I mean, it's, I think, a new design for the Irish flag should have the corporate tax rate in the middle of the flag. I mean, it's reached that extent of full spectrum acceptance in terms, that's what we have to have. It's almost like become what it means to be Irish in the 21st century, is to have the lowest corporation tax rate in Europe. And this is where I begin from. My background, as Kathleen pointed out, is in ecological green unsustainability politics, which I'll spend a bit of time about as one of the reasons why I think economic growth is biophysically impossible, just in terms of the science. And one of the many projects that I'll probably throw out here as part of my talk, I'd love to get engaged in, is to work with scientists, particularly physicists, ecologists, in asking them what do they think the principles of an ecological society would be. My guess is it wouldn't be one based on endless economic growth and endless use of carbon fuels, for example. And that's precisely the problem that we have in our economic system. It's carbon-fueled consumer capitalism, if that isn't too many C's. And it's also debt-based, which I'll talk about as well. So it's not just ecologically unsustainable, but also socially unjust in terms of managing and reproducing inequality, and doesn't add after a threshold to human quality of life. So these are my three reasons, which I will sadly repeat ad nauseum to you. So you get this is your take-home message. The three main foci of my talk, and indeed my work, is on the unsustainability of orthodox economic growth in terms of the planet simply cannot sustain the levels of economic growth that we enjoy in Ireland. For example, if everyone was to live like us, we need at least 3 other planets. in terms of the amount of energy resources. It makes you feel any better. In America, the ecological footprint is about 5 planets. And if you want a simple definition of sustainability, it's one planet living. And there's issues that I can't go into tonight in terms of the global maldistribution of resources and life opportunities, that if we're living a 2.5, 3 planet lifestyle, there are other people in other parts of the world living way below their fair share of the planet's resources. That's a major ethical, and legal and indeed moral issue. So that's the brute fact that the planet, Mother Nature, excuse the gender terms, does not do bailouts. There are certain non-negotiable thermodynamic, physical laws of the universe that we cannot transcend. And these are rather like gravity, unlike what I mentioned a moment ago, how economic growth is often presented as a force of nature, almost a physical law that we cannot argue against. There are some physical laws that we have to attend to. The second one, particularly of interest for the people in the social justice interest research area, is equality. Economic growth, my argument is, manages, reproduces, and it actively creates inequalities rather than solves it, for a variety of technical but also ideological reasons. And then the last one, this is perhaps the one that's of most interest to me, and I think where more research needs to be done, is to identify the threshold beyond which economic growth no longer adds appreciably to human flourishing. Because this is, and I'll point out, the argument I'm making is that growth isn't always negative. There's a point at which if you're very poor, a very low development area or base, growth is good, but there's a point beyond which economic growth actually becomes uneconomic growth, which I'll talk about in a moment in terms of human flourishing. So these are the 3 criteria I think that any realistic, normatively justifiable political economy should attend to in looking at economic policies. Does it help us make the transition away from unsustainability towards a low-carbon economy? Does it increase or decrease extreme forms of inequality? Because I'm not arguing for strict equality. It's in terms of what's the permissible band of inequality that we need for a functioning society. And of course, human flourishing. In other words, we have equality proofing certainly up the north in terms of very well developed Section 75, we have the screen policies. Well, where is the human flourishing proofing? Is that where we should be seeing public policy going in terms of, well, is this policy actually going to increase or decrease human flourishing? So my view is not completely anti. If you can defend or demonstrate to me a form of economic growth that's low carbon, lowers inequality, and increases human flourishing, great stuff. My difficulty is we don't have that form of growth. And it's impossible, particularly to decouple the material pollution intensity of economic growth without thinking of science fiction types of increases in efficiency. We are going to have to start dealing with something that we find very difficult in liberal democratic politics and a capitalist economy, is shifting our politics away from the politics of supply to actually looking at consumption and demand. And that's a much more, I think, pointed discussion around redistribution. Because it's easy to pass off claims of dissent. We say, well, it's okay, yeah, you're getting a small piece of the economic pie, but isn't it bigger than it was last year? And that's how economic growth acts as a way of managing inequality. Now, before I begin, I want to distinguish between different types of economic growth. I think there are models of pro-poor economic growth. You can have, if you properly design, particularly social policies, transfers and protections, there are forms of even orthodox economic growth can actually be very beneficial. And so the argument here would be that for many parts of the world, this is the type of growth that is needed in China, in India, in Africa, in terms of pro-poor economic growth, particularly to achieve at least one of the Millennium Development Goals, lifting those people on, the billion people on less than $1 a day and so on. So pro-poor economic growth is possible. It's also possible, we'll move a step, you can have pro-egalitarian economic growth. And not just the Swedish model, but that's always the classic example, but there are ways in which even orthodox economic growth can be designed with appropriate social policies, protections, transfers and so on, that minimises the extremes of economic inequality that we certainly experienced in neoliberal Anglo-American capitalist societies over the last 30 years. It is also possible up to a point to have low carbon forms of economic growth. And this is where most of the debate, certainly in Europe, and indeed in some Green parties, of which I'm a member. I'm also a Green Party councillor, so I'm a politician as well as an academic. Even Green parties are loath often to question economic growth because they think, and this is an issue I want to come back to towards the end, how do you sell this? How do you sell this to people? Because it's very difficult to question something that is seen as uncompromisingly good. Why would you be against growth? So even Green parties, Green movements, governments, they're using often technological supply-side production processes to decouple the carbon intensity of production to enable us to literally have our cake and eat it. We can have electric cars powered by windmills rather than saying, well, maybe do we need private car transport to the extent that we have now at the minute? Surely the demand in a contemporary society is for mobility. In a complex 21st century society where we need interconnection, mobility is the policy problem. Why is car the solution, whether it's powered by nuclear, renewable or fossil fuels? Is it not about looking at walking, cycling, public transportation and so on? But this is where most of the debate you find, certainly in Europe and most governments, is around green growth. The one I'm going to talk about is one that's less mentioned in public, certainly, and even in the academy. It's what I'm calling uneconomic growth. This is the growth that doesn't address inequalities, in fact it exacerbates them. Growth that continues our carbon dependency and resource intensity of production, in other words, continuing this unsustainability, and then finally doesn't actually add and starts to diminish forms of human flourishing within society. And this is what we're up against. A good example of the irrational logic of economic growth, which I could, and in other work I've called provocatively the ideology of the cancer cell. That's what cancer is. There are cells that up to a point are healthy for a body, and then they become cancerous when they transgress a threshold and then become a threat to the host. And I think that's we're in the stage now. We're in the cancer stage of capitalism. Use that very, you can see I like my alliteration. But this is from the New Economics Foundation, and it's called the Impossible Hamster. Given the whole, it's on YouTube, they've got a whole animation around it. You see it there. I think it's a Chinese story of rice doubling and so on, just to show that even at what seems like a very modest growth rate, this one here is doubling and so on. If the hamster keeps growing, essentially it's ginormous. And it's the reason why in nature, the last point there, things stop growing after a while. Even human beings, although I have to say my own midriff is getting wider as I get older. But basically in nature, nothing grows forever. Now this is not to be an environmental determinist to say, well, just because it happens in nature, we have to do it. But it just gives an indication that maybe there's a point beyond which growth has to become something different in terms of development. In other words, the planet itself is not growing. It is developing through evolution, through the arrival of species like ourselves. It's not physically growing. In the same way, ourselves, we stop growing after a certain point, but we stop developing. In other words, you can have qualitative forms of development that are then detached from quantitative forms of economic growth. I make three assumptions here as well, some of which I've picked up on what I've said already. The first one is, it does cause some controversy among some people, and I may even hear today. I think poverty is caused by inequality. If you want to deal with poverty, you deal with inequality. And it's amazing how our public debate, our policy discourse is much more comfortable talking about poverty, the socially excluded, the marginalised, and not talking about inequality. So for me, I stand on this assumption that when I deal with poverty, you deal with inequality. This issue I've already mentioned is that orthodox GDP, undifferentiated economic growth does not tackle inequalities, and it's not the same as development. We need to start moving into talking about different forms of development. Herman Daly, who's one of the founding figures in green political economy, or a branch of it called Ecological Economics, which is basically trying to bring together the natural sciences, particularly ecology and physics and economics. The argument here is, how can we have development without growth? Or to echo Tim Jackson's book that I mentioned a moment ago, how can we have progress and prosperity without growth. Is to begin to start saying that, why are these necessarily attached together? Why is development attached to growth, or indeed prosperity necessarily attached to growth? And really this is a biophysical issue. The analogy would be here that the human economy is a subsystem of the larger ecosystem, the energy, the hydrological cycle and so on, that's fixed. With the exception of solar radiation we get from the sun, everything on the planet is fixed in terms of either it regenerates, or if we happen to use fossil fuels, it depletes and so forth. So the issue here is, how can a subsystem expand beyond the parameters of the larger system? It's rather like a balloon in a box. At some point the balloon bursts. So the issue here is, how do we create an economy that's in harmony, in sustainability with the planet, that provides us with a decent, high human flourishing form of life, lower socioeconomic inequality, and also then make sure that we pass on a habitable and usable planet with resources and options for the future. Forgive me if this is kind of basic for many of you, but the reality is, and this is where economics, a discipline that I learned here from probably the most right-wing economist I've ever come across, the McDougalls, Vicky Moore, the other fellow's brother. It tells you nothing, economics, about, it focus on economic growth, at the quality. And this is part of the undifferentiated nature of often the analysis of economic growth. It doesn't tell us what the quality of that is, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But here's a more controversial or interesting observation, is that, and one of the see some empirical evidence to back this up, is whether, even in times of recession, there are some positives in terms of people rediscovering communal bonds, because they have to, that have been sundered because you live in such a high consumption, individualised life and so on. But the point here that the New Economics Foundation makes in terms of people becoming healthier. The nearest example I have of this empirically is some work that a student of mine did on Cuba years ago, when the Soviet Union collapsed in '89 and Cuba went through its special period. Cuba effectively went through its own peak oil moment, where it had to basically retool its economy. And there's some evidence to show that, with the exception of the initial period, was a shock, that actually Cubans were healthier after the shock than they were before. So it's an interesting conundrum. Now, is there such a thing as the progressive elements of an economic recession? I mean, that's kind of heterodox in itself to say, but it's an interesting one to think about. But the issue here is, we have to start thinking that certain types of growth are economic and therefore they're good, and other types are uneconomic and therefore bad or negative, and they have to be questioned. It shouldn't be seen as a good to be held on in all cases. That's where it becomes ideological on the one hand, but actually becomes a structural imperative of the system. I think both of those things are going on. Economic growth has now achieved what I would say is full spectrum ideological domination over the populace, over policymakers. It also has now become, and has been for quite some time, a structural imperative of a capitalist system. For those of you who've learned your classical Marxism, the economic growth in this case is the equivalent of capital accumulation. It also has to do with issues around the fiduciary duty of capitalist firms or corporations to make profits and so forth. And I give 3 reasons why the system under capitalism, so I'm leaving open the possibility, well, what about post-capitalism? When we talk about that, but certainly a capitalist system is locked into economic growth. One is that the state is expenditures planned on economic growth. If you don't achieve economic growth, as you know, it causes difficulties in public expenditure, investment and infrastructure. Companies, this fiduciary duty, which many of us don't know. I was reared as a good Marxist in the 80s, hate all these capitalists and so on, that they were all, raping the planet and so forth, and almost like James Bond villains who sit there stroking a white cat every morning saying, how can we wreck the planet and exploit people? I'm sure there must be elements of that in the corporate world and so on. The film The Corporation is quite good at looking at the psychology of both the corporation itself, but also those who operate. But actually, there's a kind of a mundane, legal, structural reason, is that the decision makers in corporations are honour bound and legally bound to act in certain ways that actually increase the unsustainability of the system. They may not like it, but they have an obligation. In other words, they could go to jail if they do not fulfill the maximum of actually getting the most profit. Now, this can be changed, of course. And there's a wonderful writer called Marjorie Kelly, who's written a book called The Divine Right of Capital, where she spent a lot of time talking about how can we rewrite the rules of the corporation and actually return, and writing from an American perspective, in terms of how corporations were set up in the 18th and 19th century for a limited time purpose function, build a bridge and so on, and then they were disbanded. So in other words, the corporation as we now know it is not set in stone, or it's not some sort of force of nature again. It can be changed. We can change the legal rules under which corporations operate. And what about building in gender bottom lines? What about building in sustainability bottom lines as well as profit bottom lines for corporations? This is all perfectly possible. Of course, a big issue politically in terms of the structures and the power that you're up against. The last point then is the issue of why a positive rate of interest in the economy is a structural reason for growth. Because if you lend that interest, you're expecting not just the £5 you lent, but £5 plus whatever, 50p, whatever the rate of interest happens to be. So these are some of the reasons why in a capitalist system, unless the system grows on average about 3% a year, we have difficulties, as we have now since 2008. Essentially, we've designed under capitalism a system that has two modes of operation, like a bicycle. And it goes along at 3%, or if you're in China, you're lucky 10% of it powering along, or it collapses. That's the two modes we've designed in a capitalist economy. It either goes and grows, or it collapses. And here's the thing, from an ecological point of view, that at a compound growth rate of 3% a year, in less than 25 years, the economy has doubled. So that means if we are continuing carbon intensity, resource use, water extraction, pollution and so on, and we're looking at 3% of growth a year, we're talking about the economy doubling every 25 years, with all the enormous ecological strains that actually causes. So what I'm talking about here, why I particularly emphasise undifferentiated GDP or economic growth, is that we need to differentiate. Some growth does contribute to quality of life. I think the growth of libraries, for example, I think the growth of kidney dialysis machines. In other words, I don't think that what I'm arguing for is against any type of growth. If we differentiate, we say, well, what types of growth do we want? I think the growth rate of prostitution in our society, of people being trafficked in the sex industry, that's a bad. But actually it adds to our GDP, often through a strange and indirect way. So the issue is, how do we differentiate good, of course we have to unpack what good means, from bad forms of economic growth. And I've picked out here some examples which may be familiar to you, what I call here in economics, it's defensive consumption. If we have to hire security guards and we have to, because of declines in social trust or fear of crime, we have to buy water, we have to today, rather than getting water out of the tap because it's bad water, it's not been properly filtered or whatever. Or we have to buy lots of children's toys at home out of town because the parents are too busy in terms of their work. These are all, I would call, uneconomic defensive forms of consumption. In other words, we're spending more of our income on trying to protect some degree of our quality of life as opposed to actually enhancing opportunities for human flourishing. But GDP does not distinguish between those two. In fact, what would have helped Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland's GDP today is that if I didn't travel down, I cycled from my home to the station in Hollywood, and then I got the train into Belfast Central, and then I got the train down here, and then I cycled from Connolly Station to UCD. Now, what I should have done was, to really increase GDP, is drove or hired a car, drove like a lunatic, maybe crashed into a few other cars on the way, then maybe got into such a fight with my wife that we decided we're going to get separated. And guess what? All of these, ching, 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 all of these add to GDP. The people have to come out and sort out your car. The overtime maybe of the mechanic has to come out and do it. The lawyers you have to go and hire them to deal with your divorce. All of these things add to GDP. It's an extremely inaccurate and very unrevealing, in that sense, measurement. And yet we've fetishised it. We've fetishised this lunatic form of measurement as the holy grail of policy. Even orthodox economists will admit that, but always sotto voce. Yeah, we kind of know it's not really a measurement, but we have no other one they want to use with. But I think that's the point we're at now. We have to start getting more accurate, more refined, fine-grained, definitions, refined forms of measurement of the things we want to have in our society. Because it doesn't distinguish between good and bad forms of production or economic activity. And indeed, if we have to ask this question, what types of sectors do we want to see growing in our economy? Because really, from an economic point of view, they're famously, they see themselves as, they suffer from physics envy, actually, most orthodox economists. They want to be like a hard science, objective, neutral, and so on, which is crap. Orthodox economics, neoclassical economics, is the dominant form of economics taught in most universities in the world, is as ideological as ecologism, as ideological as feminism, and has played this blinder of an ideological sleight of hand that it's managed to present itself as objective. That's why, remember folks, economists are asked to comment in the media not because what they say is correct or true, but because they're asked. But yet we've empowered this particular discipline because managing the economy is an expert form of knowledge that we need, and so on. That's a whole, I'll touch upon that towards the end, the idea of economics as an ideology itself, but particularly economic growth as an ideology. And I have no problem with it. I have a problem with when they pretend they are not ideological. It's very mainstream. The sense of homo economicus that lies at the heart of economics. The vision of the human person is a man, an able-bodied man who's able to work free of the messiness of domestic life. That's all taken care of by somebody else, a woman. In other words, the whole image of the human being in orthodox economics is completely undifferentiated in terms of it doesn't take account of people with caring responsibilities. It takes no account of the undulations of a human life. In terms of there are times when we can all work 24/7, 365, and there are times when we can't do that. What happens at the end of life and the start of life in terms of care and vulnerability and so on. None of these are factored into the image of the human being at the heart of economics. So this post-growth economy, it is consistent with growth in some sectors, so long as, particularly from an ecological point of view, the overall scale of the economy doesn't transgress certain ecological limits. In other words, it's about redistribution of resources and so on within an economy, as opposed to saying that growth doesn't happen. Growth can happen in some sectors so long as there's a threshold that isn't transgressed. And Toynbee here, as some of you may know, I think is a lovely definition of this is the growth that we want. This is what we should have. It's the non-material side. It's echoing in a way a minor heterodox tradition within political theory and political economy, most eloquently expressed by John Stuart Mill, the great liberal philosopher. In his Principles of Political Economy, Book 4, written in 1848, he could already see, he wrote that there will come a time in Britain when we'd have to move on from simply getting and consuming to considering education and the finer things in life. He could already see, back then, there'll be a point at which issues of distribution and development will become more important than simply economic growth and so on. And here we are in 2013, still continuing on this economic growth treadmill and all that pertains to it. And this, unfortunately, is how mainstream economics, open up any mainstream economic textbook. Begg, Fisher and Dornbush is the one that I remember from my undergraduate years here. But open up any of them. And it's the most amazing vision of human society and the world. Nature doesn't appear. It's basically there's firms and there's individual consumers. Unions don't appear. Women don't appear. The domestic sphere, doesn't appear. It's a complete abstraction. And of course, the biggest abstraction of all, upon which quite a lot of orthodox economics rests, is the complete fiction of perfect competition. There's nowhere in the real world that perfect competition actually exists. And yet it's used to justify quite a lot of the nostrums of conventional economics, including, using, in the context of globalization, the idea of comparative advantage, that, different, and it's a way of justifying global trade. But that doctrine is from David Ricardo in the 19th century, when capital was fixed. In a world where capital can move, that law of comparative advantage doesn't hold, and yet that's still being taught and reproduced and replicated and used to justify economic policies of competitiveness and openness in trade. Moving on now to inequality. Essentially there again, not particularly recent reference, what I'm saying here is nothing new, but perhaps it's because this has been a heterodox position, this idea of questioning growth. It's not the mainstream view, but you can go back and you can find this is one from Wallach in 1972. And in a way it explains particularly the sociological phenomenon in America of the American dream. There's this sense that, how can we explain why people on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum will vote against taxes on the rich? And we have the evidence that, folk there won't do this. It's because of this absolute belief. Well, I'm not going to vote against that because I could be a millionaire, or my kids could be. And it's the one major developed country where there's a very relaxed, to put it mildly, attitude to inequality. It really is an outlier in terms of the way in which the doctrine, if you like, or the ideological myth, I would say, of the American dream has actually achieved quite a lot in terms of disciplining people and people buying into this particular. People can pick up and criticise me on that point, but it's just an example, a very good example of how growth and the promise of growth and wealth can actually justify and make people be content with inequality. Particularly daily, it's a great way, and most of our politics is based around this. I mean, coming up to election time, most political parties, it's a beauty contest about who's going to manage the economy, make it grow, competitiveness, bring jobs and so on. And again, particularly in times of austerity. So really, politics has been reduced, certainly since the 1970s, of great ideological battles between social democracy, socialism, and conservatism, and so on, down to who's going to be the effective manager of the economy, which also coincides, interesting enough, with the rise of economics as an important advisor to government. Governments don't typically call in political theorists to complicate things. No, give us an economist and give us an A4 sheet and give us a couple of numbers. That's another thing in terms of the way in which economics operates, is you get this false sense of certainty and authority because we have figures. And it's one of the great bugbears of mine in terms of teaching citizenship, as I do, that one of the greatest skills we can teach citizens today is a basic knowledge of statistics. Because it's amazing how statistical our political discourse, certainly around election time, vote for me because we have increased, the healthcare system by, real terms by 10%. That's really good. But if you actually say, well, what's the base year you're talking about? If you, disaggregate, you say, well, actually, he's describing a decline. And why hasn't he compared it to a comparative country in Europe and so on? But yet people are bamboozled by the use of statistics, which is why we should always have this in our mind whenever we hear statistics being used, is that she uses statistics like a drunk uses a lamppost for support rather than illumination. And that's why it's so important that we get some basic mathematical and statistical knowledge, I think, in concepts of critical citizenship. Again, another way of describing the economic growth model, again, is trickle down. That we can, you can use Rawlsian justifications that we can justify inequality as long as everybody gets better, on the basis that some of the wealth will trickle down. Well, we've had the opposite happen. Conor will probably correct me if I'm right on this. A steam-up effect in terms of the last 20 years, particularly under neoliberalism in the Anglo-American countries. But this, in a way, is a modern version of that wonderful phrase from Adam Smith that you may have heard: a rising tide raises all boats. Well, that may be true, but if you're in a small little curragh against a massive liner, it does make a difference. That's another way of visualising, I have a metaphor, this economic growth dilemma. Yes, growth can lift everybody up, but it does matter the size of the craft that you're in, whether or not you're going to be drowned by the swell of the bigger boats, or being excluded from social opportunities because of inequality. A little bit more technical, because what's interesting about this is that what's gone unremarked in the debate around the global crash we had in 2008. Lehman Brothers goes belly up, and that's kind of, the torch paper that set everything off. The property bubble, all these strange exotic flora and fauna of finance, credit default swaps and so on. Yes, they were all there, but actually what was being missed, and this guy here, Michael Kumhoff, works for the IMF. I'm amazed they allowed him to write this. He did a study, had to wade through lots of maths and the way econometrics works. But essentially, they compared the crash of the 1930s and what happened prior to 2008. And what they found was a consistent pattern, that in both cases, the crashes were preceded by exacerbating income inequalities, and particularly debt-to-income ratios amongst lower to middle-income households. And essentially, there's an instability that builds into the system. If you have too much at the top, savings of the super rich, the elite, the 1%, want to know where are we going to invest this money that we have sloshing around, and then the 99% who've been bought off with cheap credit as a substitute for increases in real wages. And that's what's happened in the last 20 years. Wages haven't increased in real terms, but people are able to substitute that, and it was masked by the availability of cheap, easy credit, often with an asset, i.e. your house. Your house is no longer a home. It was an asset against which then you could borrow and so on. And now this may be me and my recidivist Marxism, but I think it's generally a good way of looking at it, is that the share of national income is an outcome of class bargaining in terms of workers, how unionised, how strong they are, social market economy, of course, the governance system set in place, and so on. And I think the role of the state. So I'll leave that hanging there. We can come back to it in terms of, it's a provocative thought, I think, one that has some compelling evidence, if not moment of justification, in terms of class politics is not dead, folks. It's just been masked by a whole variety of, we talk about poverty and the poor, and not the working class, and so on. But what come off and then go on, and the bit I want to highlight here is the bit at the bottom, is redistribution. This is from the IMF. He's a fairly orthodox economist, but the figures are telling him the story that actually redistribution will be a better way of addressing some of the problems we now have than ex-post policies such as bailouts or debt restructurings. And of course, which is the one we've gone for, is these ones, not the redistribution. And it isn't amazing, just as a final point in the global economic crisis, how a private sector disaster in the finance sector becomes transmogrified into public sector austerity. I mean, it's the equivalent of alchemy, of turning dross into gold. And how could a private sector problem suddenly then it becomes the public sector? Yes, another reason, too big to fail, we need a finance system in the modern world and so on, but it's amazing still to me how that, people forget that this is a private sector. Let them go to the wall rather than bailing out. And it's amazing as well with things like quantitative easing, which is the equivalent of just basically making up money out of thin air, how we could bail out banks and we can't pay our nurses. And that, there is an element of that debate certainly down here, but I don't think it's strong enough to really, bring that home to people. That the issue is not that the money isn't there, it's the political will. The money is there. Or in the UK context, how is it we could go and organise a war, an illegal war in Iraq, the cost of billions of pounds, but now we're cutting the NHS? How can we support a new generation of Trident missiles and more support for the army and not fund our schools? No, we're going to privatise them. It's amazing how people question that. To me, it's very, very stark in terms of the redistribution of resource on the basis of different power differentials in society going on at the moment. And this is why I like post-growth economics, because it brings back redistribution with a vengeance. If the cake isn't growing effectively, you can no longer push people away or pawn them off. Yeah, you know, the size of your the share is still very, very small, but listen, is it better than last year? Well, if the cake isn't growing, it's a very strange person that would say, you know, I'm quite happy staying my little tiny little bit here. It's not growing and you have a lot. You have to begin to talk about this issue of renegotiating the social contract in terms of what, you know, this is, to me, the radical political potential of a post-growth position is not just a technical adjustment of the economy, it's a transformation or a transformational opportunity for an entire political and social and economic order. So you can't justify claims of injustice with pro-growth rationale, the kind of Rawlsian argument. Well, yeah, we can justify inequality because it increases the overall, you know, welfare or the economy. Well, if the economy isn't growing, we have to come up with some other rationale. Doesn't mean to say we have an absolute, you know, mechanical egalitarianism, but certainly the levels of inequality that we've experienced and exist now, in my view, can no longer be politically sustainable in terms of the tensions, the social tensions that post-growth economy will have to deal with. Moving on then to social flourishing, so we've done sustainability, low carbon, the environmental arguments of why growth is biophysically impossible, how it manages doesn't really address inequalities, and the final one is issues around human flourishing or quality of life, well-being. And not all these are the same. I'd say the reason why I like flourishing is that I think pain and unhappiness and death are natural parts of the human condition. I'm not interested in promoting just ideas that we ought to be happy. That's what it's about. Flourishing. Flourishing is consistent with integrating into our lives those aspects we often find difficult. That's what a part of, for me, the human condition is, and that's what my book is partly about. That's why I like flourishing as opposed to happiness and quality of life. So when you see me using well-being or quality of life, they are not quite the same as human flourishing. There's a whole separate paper there in terms of why flourishing, I think, is a different concept than simply quality of life and well-being. But that's what most of the debate, these are from the UK Cabinet Office, this is under the last Labour government, and it's from the Swedish, they're both saying the same thing. There's a point beyond which a threshold has been reached, a sweet spot, beyond which more economic growth doesn't actually add to human flourishing. And yet this was sat on, certainly in the UK context, because it wasn't on message, because it's too potentially radical in terms of its implications. And really the issue here is whether, and maybe this is one form of economic growth as expressed in consumerism, or to put consumerism you can define as buying crap you don't need to impress people you don't care about. And that is an engine of growth in our economy in terms of consumption. Is that consumerism actually takes away forms of human happiness. A response from the left, or because often the left have been critical of green arguments against growth because they saw them as denying working class people access to the goods of development and so on. It's quite an intemperate debate that goes on between the left and the Greens on this issue. But actually, one of the more, I think, level-headed responses from the broad left is the International Labour Organization. It did a massive survey, a piece of work back in the early part of 2000, and produced it then in this report, Security for a Better World. And you can see it there. It says the most important determinant of national happiness is not income level. Yes, there's positive association. When you're very poor, there is obviously a positive contribution. More income makes to your quality of life and so on. But the key factor is the extent of income security, measured in terms of income protection and a low degree of income inequality. So there's some, and this is based on I think it was 15 country survey. Obviously this has to be replicated, but it does seem to have it certainly fits with my argument that if we want to increase quality of life, we definitely have to lower socioeconomic inequality and actually start increasing social and income protection. Next, in 2009, some of you may know this, where they did, surprisingly to me, begin to outline some of these more quality of life, post-growth potential modelling for the Irish economy. But of course, like a lot of what official government bodies do, a bit like the Irish football team, great on paper, crap on grass. Just sat there gathering dust, I'm sure, to this day in terms of, the great way for governments to do it, they do a report. And then you hope you keep it in the long grass and people forget about it, and so on. And the reason why this is important, this issue of human flourishing or quality of life, with the provisos I mentioned in terms of not the same thing, it's from Tim Jackson's book, is that the single biggest determinant, judged over a lifetime of a human being, of your overall well-being, is not income. Yes, money makes up a bit. It's being connected, particularly in a loving relationship. It's the single biggest determinant over the course of life to add to your well-being. Then your health, nice place to live, and so on. So it's not that income, community and friends, obviously important, spiritual life. In other words, what makes for most of, and this is from a meta-survey of social psychological studies, so what makes for well-being for human beings is relationships. So maybe that's another indication of what a post-growth public policy should be about. Designing public policy to support relationships, communities, strengthening communities, and so on, rather than going for this bit. That's where most of our politics and economics is all about this. And why aren't we protecting these elements, and so on? So it's just an argument again for the importance of a well-being perspective. And Jackson, in an earlier work, this is nicely put it, because people would say, well, an anti-growth or negative growth is a very negative way of selling it, and people see it in terms of sacrifice and loss, that you're denying them something that they already have. Well, Jackson turns that on its head. He says, what are we losing now? We're losing connection. We're losing meaningful free time, less stress in our lives. Because this economic system is based upon mobility. It's based on rapidity, and so on. You can look at the work of Paul Virillo and so on. It nice complements this in terms of the speeding up of life. How more stressed even I am because I know there's emails popping in as we speak and so on. It's all part of productivity, adding to economic growth. So the issue is what's been denied to us now because of this economic growth system and so it's not in terms of what we're losing if we move beyond growth, it's what we're losing now because of growth, which I think is a much better way of presenting it. The last bit of what I want to say is this idea of economic growth as ideology. Because certainly I think when you question economic growth, you get either one of two reactions. You're just seen as absolutely mad because it's almost like, as I mentioned a few times now, economic growth is a natural part of the social order. It's like that human beings need each other to learn language. It's up there with some sort of evolutionary imperative that we have to have a growing economy. Or it's very ideological because of the reaction against it. And often you can judge something by the reaction and you say, wow, that's really... In other words, it'll tell you more about the other person reacting negatively than it is about your proposition. And certainly arguing against economic growth has both of these. You're seen as, I've had this even in my own school. Looking quick, there goes John. The green stuff. We listen to him, yeah. Now the big boys are going to get on and we'll do the real stuff about the economy. So you're just kind of dismissed because you're just not seen as being with the programme. You're denying some irrefutable imperative in the social world. But I think this is what's going on. Of course, they're both compatible with each other. That people believe it's a force of nature, that we can't change it. And therefore, if you do question it, you're just seen as crazy. I do think what's going on, and people know the work of J.B. Thompson, great theorist of ideology, you can see this. Economic growth is a very good example of what Thompson calls in terms of the mobilization of meaning. I have a very simple view of human beings and society. We tell stories to each other. There's a narrative. What's a story? And there's a positive story about growth, because growth is associated with maturation, it's about development, it's about progress, and it's that sense, certainly in the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment period, of an ever upward increase in linear development. You just think of it either in terms of how Enlightenment, the philosophes and so on in France and Europe are talking about the Enlightenment as a movement away from superstition, using science and rationality to create a better world. Fast forward that then to Aneurin Bevan and the Labour government in the post-war period, killing the 5 great squalors, or the evils of the contemporary world through the NHS. It's kind of a similar idea of onward and upward progress. So it's very difficult, you can see why arguing against it, because it's so thoroughly imbued with positive potentials. And I do think that we have processes of reification, legitimation, the simulation, which I won't go into now. And certainly I've done a lot of work on looking at the economics discipline as a form of ideological construct. Well, I'm going to finish up now, if you would like. I'm going to not go on all of this, but what's the potentials in terms of politics? I think it is about questioning the dominant narrative of economic recovery, which is essentially code word for getting back to economic growth. And I do think it potentially opens up a transformative sphere. Very radical. I'm not saying that there's not replete with difficulties and so on, but it does present itself as a way of unpacking and rethinking both what the economy is and what economics is. I think that's quite and actually it signals a return to political economy. The importance of politics, and that economics is not some technical aspect of human society, because last time I looked, we lived in societies with economies, not in economies with a bit of society as a side dish. But actually that's how, this is Polanyi, Karl Polanyi, the similar idea that we've put economics at the centre rather than putting the economy to the work of social goals and so on. So I do think there is an opportunity for fundamental rethink. And a crisis always does that. I mean, crisis can go, also regressively. We're fools to think that the progress is made, certainly, for example, in the welfare state or social protection, cannot be rolled back even further than they have done now. And we end up refighting, those of us who are self-styled progressives and so on, refighting battles we thought we'd lost. So, there can be regress in these contexts of crisis, but also there can be positive potential for something new. And again, it's that idea of chew it around and see what you think of it, replacing economic growth, something like economic security. But it's a hard sell, because it's seen as anti-aspirational, seen as backward. Like if I had a penny for every time I was told at a meeting, you Greens want to bring us back to the Stone Age or back to a pre-Enlightenment period and so on. It's simply automatically a default position for people to react against things like this. And the challenge is, how do you promote a new paradigm in thinking about the economy? It's difficult but not impossible, particularly in the context of austerity, because most people want to get back to where they were, and partly because it's the dominance of what we already know. We know growth. Okay, we may not like it all, but we know it. But this post-growth stuff, it's a bit of a risk. And that's, of course, the same with any radical or transformative change. And really, this is the issue. What's the story? And I have played around with, and I won't go into it now, about and I speak as an atheist and as an internationalist, as the preface what I'm going to say, given the dominance of nationalist stories and the dominance in certain aspects of religious thought, can we attach and use those, for example, as well as more conventional, politically progressive storylines to progress? What would Jesus buy? What would Jesus drive? And say, well, you're a Christian, or you're a Buddhist, or you're a follower of Islam. How's that consistent with presiding over the desecration of the planet, which we don't own? We're stewards. It's God's. So what's the Christian response in times of this? Or a nationalist one, is that the story we can tell for the Republic of Ireland? Is that in the context of a post-conflict Northern Ireland and a post-Celtic Tiger South, that we now see this new development model of post-growth, that we can tell a story of Irish, historical social development in the context of this? Again, I haven't really thought it through, and I'm aware of the dangers of attaching progressive ideas to what I think are regressive ideologies. I'm just thinking pragmatically in terms of mobilising people. So what do we need? I think, just to give you one example of, I do think we need to start shifting our thinking from formally paid employment, which of course is what the big ticket item for every politician and most people out there, to ideas of work. Work is not coextensive with formally paid employment, particularly gendered work that goes on in the home. That's completely missing from our national statistics, the gendered work that goes on in the home, without which the economy could not function. If women, because it's mostly women who do this, if they went on strike, you would quickly see how the corporate executive could turn up without their shirts ironed, or looking well because their partner has done something, as often amateur de-stressing for the corporate warrior and so forth. I mean, a very provocative way of presenting this is to ask each company to calculate how much is it worth to your company that your chief financial officer is potty trained. Yeah, we laugh because of the puerile nature, but actually is an important point, is that without often the gendered labour that goes on in the domestic sphere, all of this doesn't happen. But guess what? We don't hear on RTE News, GDP is up, and of course all our hearts sing, GDP is up, I feel much better. What about the gendered labour that goes on in the home, which of course doesn't get recognised, it doesn't appear on our national statistics and so on. This is an issue of that GDP needs to be completely, I think, rethought in terms of how do we include aspects of gendered labour and so on. And Boyle and Sims here, just in terms of work, really have to think that it's work that we're focusing on, of which part of it will be formally paid employment. So it's a very different understanding of the economy and work. And I think this is my last slide. It does move, as I think, in a form of direction, a model. I think Paddock Kirby, whose work some of you certainly know, of an EcoSocial, a new model of development for states. I think it's a lot more sharing of resources, partly for ecological reasons. Public transportation is mile per person carried more energy efficient than one person sitting in a car. So sharing. I have a particular love and affinity for libraries. I think they're the most radical, subversive institutions we have because they separate ownership from use. They go against completely the neoliberal logic of you having to own everything, the Amazonization of society, where I'll just click on there and I'll buy that book. Libraries, I'm amazed, are still in existence. And I think a lot more libraries and that type of sharing and collective forms of consumption are part of what perhaps a post-growth economy is about. I think it's also meaningful free time, not unemployment. That's of course the cheap retort. Oh well, you should be delighted, John, that the economy has crashed because the planet's getting a breather and people now have more time. No, I'm not. One is that it points to the irrational nature of our economy, that the planet's only getting a breather because of no planned decision by ourselves. And I don't see unemployment as meaningful free time. I think we also shift in terms of moving away from this focus on the public and private formal economy to a convivial or social economy, but again back with economic security as a replacement for economic growth. And really what we should do from an ecological point of view is not improving the ecological efficiency of economic growth. That's where a lot of this low carbon, green growth stuff is about. It's about how do we get more bang from our buck in terms of energy resources and so on. Well, how can we get more bang for our buck for human flourishing? And I think I'll leave the last word to Wilkinson and Pickett. I do think we have reached the end of a road in developed countries or overdeveloped countries. Our problems now are ones of redistribution, not necessarily more economic growth as is conventionally understood. It doesn't make it easy, of course, given, as I said, the inherited power of economic growth as an ideology. But these are the choices we have to make. So thank you for listening.